Coming up will be Maryland gubernatorial candidate Michael Rosenbaum. And if you didn't know about him, he worked for the Clinton administration, and there he is. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Good afternoon. I'm great. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you. And as I mentioned, before we get into a little bit of nuts and bolts, how was it working with President Clinton?
So I confess I was many layers down inside the Clinton White House. So to say that I was working directly with President Clinton would definitely be an overstatement. I was an economist in the weeds, working originally on tech stuff and then on how we think about different communities across the country that have historically been undervalued. And so that's what I was working on. But I met him, but did not work directly with him.
That's all right. But did some of what you learned with your work as an economist help transcend to make this decision to run for governor?
Absolutely. So I've dedicated my whole life to the idea that talent's everywhere, but opportunity isn't. And that if we don't solve that basic problem, if we can't match talent with opportunity so that each person has a pathway to economic security, then our communities can collapse. And that's what I worked on as an economist. And that's why, actually, after working as an economist, I ended up moving to Baltimore because in Baltimore, there was a GM plant and a Bethlehem steel plant that were on their last legs. And historically, there had been a swath of our communities who had had pathways because of the relationship between organized labor and manufacturing and industry into middle-class jobs and into economic security. And those jobs were going away. And so the question is, what's next? And so I had originally started a nonprofit organization that was called Catalyst, that was using data to identify folks that the market for jobs didn't realize were awesome, and then provide economic security and training so that folks could move into tech jobs. And when I couldn't get any folks to support the nonprofit, I shut down the nonprofit and started a for-profit company to do the same thing. And I grew that company, and for a bunch of years, frankly, people didn't care that much. And then we got lucky. And in 2011, we got a deal with Nike to build out teams to do one of the early step trackers called the Fuel Band. And that work was actually done in the DC Baltimore area, the tech work for that. And it was done with folks who a couple generations earlier might have been working at the GM plant and now might be cobbling together, cleaning rooms in a hotel or working as cashiers or working in an Amazon warehouse. And so then that company grew, and the average income in someone's last job before entering that company is $25,000 a year, and average income 5 years later is $98,000 a year. And then I started a second company that did something similar in healthcare, which, in healthcare, the big question is sort of how do we move folks into jobs like RN or manager, where we're not cobbling together minimum wage jobs, but we have middle income jobs. And I was growing these companies, and they're decent sized companies. The first company, thousands of folks in Maryland and elsewhere have been through that company. The second company is in 18% of the US healthcare workforce. But I realized I was growing these companies, but the world's moving the wrong direction. A couple segments ago, Denise and Barrington were talking about homelessness and talking about folks losing their homes because they were losing their jobs. And in Maryland, we have a higher unemployment rate than most states, and yet other places can't hire. And the question is, what can we do about it? And COVID obviously exposed this problem and accelerated it. It was already there. It was getting worse. COVID made it much worse, accelerated it. And the question is, how are we going to change our economy in the state and in the region to make sure that every single person has a pathway to a middle income job or a high income job? And that's what we actually have the ability to do. It's not impossible to do. We just haven't done it because the state has historically been focused on symptoms rather than causes. We spend huge amounts of money on healthcare for folks who are severely poor, but we don't spend much money to make sure that folks aren't poor. And what we need to be doing is spending massive amounts of money in order to ensure that everyone has economic security and training to be able to move into a career that allows each person to move into a middle income or high income job. And we actually have the tools to do it.
Interesting you brought that up. I was going to ask about a solution, because there could be some resonance, some on the other side of the aisle. The Republicans may say, well, we don't have enough money to spend to do this. So where would you get the money from? And how would you be able to do that?
Absolutely, but we do have the money, right? So we're already spending massive amounts of money on symptoms. We're spending massive amounts of money on healthcare for folks who make less than $20,000 a year. It would cost us less money to hire everyone so that no one made less than $20,000 a year than it would for us to continue providing healthcare for folks who are severely poor. And the reason is that there's a close relationship between economic security and healthiness. So again, the topic that Denise and Barrington were talking about was what happens when you lose your job and you were already on the edge, and now you're living in a tent. So you don't have air conditioning, you don't have a refrigerator, and you may not have access to healthcare. And it makes you less healthy. And as a result, we spend lots of money to ensure that folks have healthcare rather than spending the money to make sure that folks have a job and are able to develop the skills so they're not stuck in a minimum wage job 30 years later, but actually have a pathway up to a $40 an hour job and a $45 an hour job and a $50 an hour job. And if we do that, then we solve the other problems. So we're already spending the money, we're just spending it the wrong way. We don't actually need to spend more money. If anything, we'd save money by doing this rather than spend more.
Interesting. Thank you. I wanted to transition topics real quick. You probably been able to follow what's been going on in the Maryland General Assembly, the 90-day session in Annapolis. And criminal justice reform was one of the major issues besides COVID-19, obviously. And there are activists and advocates statewide who believe such things as much citizen input and control should be implemented in policies during the next 90 days legislative session that will begin in January. So what are your thoughts, sir, on criminal justice reform, and what have you seen Maryland has done well and what it can do better?
So obviously, as governor, I would work hand in hand with the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, and the General Assembly to ensure we have police accountability and ensure that we sort of deal with some of the underlying structural issues in the economy. I spent a year as a student criminal defense attorney in Massachusetts, working with someone who had been at the DC Public Defender Service named Charles Ogletree, and I worked in a place called Roxbury District Court. And I was living which is a neighborhood in Massachusetts, and I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I would sit in Roxbury District Court and I would look around, and there were lots of folks in Roxbury District Court who were charged with possession of cannabis. Sitting there in the court because they were charged with possession of cannabis. There was no one in Cambridge, Massachusetts who was charged with possession of cannabis. And so some of the basic structural problems obviously need work. And I think this last General Assembly, there was some significant positive movement on it. But I think there's actually a bigger question, which is we keep spending more money on the criminal justice system, and we keep spending more money on things like law enforcement, but we don't seem to get better outcomes. And when we think about it, no one's born planning to, end up ensnared in the criminal justice system. No one is born that way. And yet some folks end up finding themselves ensnared in the criminal justice system either unjustly or because of a lack of economic opportunity. And if we don't solve the core problem, which is lots of folks are either pushed out of the workforce or unemployed, or are stuck trying to cobble together a life at minimum wage. If we don't solve the problem of creating economic opportunity and creating pathways of economic opportunity so that there are opportunities for each person to find dignity, we're never going to solve the bigger picture set of questions, which obviously we need to solve in the criminal justice system, but we need to think of as part of a more coherent whole.
There's got a couple of questions left, sir. And just more of a general sense, if you were governor now and you see what the Delta variant is doing throughout the country, would you implement any COVID restrictions such as mandating mask inside public buildings, let's say, or at least maybe for state employees?
So I actually think that the governor has done a pretty good job dealing with COVID issues generally. I think there's obviously more that we could do. We certainly could, I think the governor has a lot of room for improvement in terms of working with community leaders and faith leaders to ensure to ensure that vaccines get to folks who aren't getting them, or maybe reluctant to get them. But I think the bigger question for us is, how do we make sure that we sort of continue rolling out vaccines? How do we make sure that we sort of continue vaccinating folks so that we're inoculated from the Delta variant? And how do we think about the downstream effects of COVID, which again, obviously we've got the sort of COVID stuff to deal with today, but COVID itself, whatever ends up happening with the Delta variant, the impacts to so many in our communities, for folks who have lost their jobs and have lost the tenuous, economic stability that they had. If we don't lean in hard on creating pathways to restructure our economy on the other side of this and take advantage of the opportunity that we all are now increasingly recognize that is the problem, that's actually the task of the next governor, and that's actually what I'll be focused on.
And I have just two more questions, sir. A question came in about taxes. And as a matter of fact, being that you're an economist, this is right up your alley.
Right up my alley.
There was a discussion actually last night, District 6, Prince George's County Council. And a couple of the candidates mentioned, actually all four of the candidates who were on, mentioned about a couple of concerns in that particular district. All four of them said property taxes, because of how about 70% of Prince George's County residents, the property taxes, and 30% are from commercial development. Will you look at cutting taxes anywhere, especially with property taxes? And if you can give a quick summary of that, please.
So property tax, I live in Baltimore City. So property taxes are actually a core structural problem that needs to get dealt with. It actually is dealt with at a local level, not a state level. But I think the bigger thing the state can do to give local jurisdictions flexibility to cut property taxes, because they're so inefficient, right? They are so inefficient. The bigger thing we can do as a state to give local jurisdictions that flexibility is to broaden the tax base. That if the tax base is broader and more folks are moving into middle income jobs, we generate more top line revenue, not by increasing or decreasing tax rates, but just by the virtue of more people are employed in middle income jobs. So if we took the couple 100,000 folks who are unemployed in the state, and did what I'm talking about, and that group of people ended up moving along the income trajectory of my first company, which again, thousands of folks in Maryland and nationally have done. If we were to do that, then we would increase general fund revenue at the state level by $2 billion a year, just in state income taxes. That gives us flexibility to do other things. That gives us the flexibility at each local jurisdiction level to massively cut property taxes, because those property taxes, again, are so inefficient in the way that we sort of think about how the pieces fit together.
And finally, sir, so when you're not out campaigning, what do you get to do just to relax yourself?
So I have a 13-year-old daughter and a 15-year-old daughter. And so I will take any minute they will give me to actually talk to me. There are not many minutes I get. Not many minutes I get, but any minute they will give me, I will take.
Understand. Well, sir, Mr. Mike Rosenbaum, thank you very much for this time, and good luck on the campaign trail. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.